Well, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're way out west. Appreciate you tuning in to us. And you are tuning in to a Head Committee Negotiated Rulemaking Week 1 Debrief, a wonderfully elegant title. This is part of the Thompson Coburn Higher Education webinar series. If you don't know us, Thompson Coburn is a law firm, sort of a national law firm. I shouldn't say sort of, we are a national law firm. We have about 480, 490 attorneys this year. At this point in time, actually. And we have offices around the country in major markets. We have a higher education practice, which means we have a group of lawyers who spend all or most of our time serving institutions of higher education. My name's Aaron Lacey. I'm a co-chair of the higher education practice and focus very much on, I will say, the regulation of higher education. So that includes at all levels with the states and the accreditors, but also certainly federal policy and regulation around higher education. And as you can see, I'm dressed today for this special holiday edition of our webinar series. Nothing says the holidays like negotiated rulemaking. Just a few notes here at the outset. Keep in mind, laws and policies are always fluid. We're going to be talking today about the negotiated rulemaking week 1 of the Head Committee that took place last week. One thing I do want to emphasize right now, and I'll keep making this point because it's so important, we are talking about draft regulations that we saw out of the department last week. They did reach consensus, but they are still only draft regulations. You will have a proposed rule that will come out in a few months, probably in the spring would be my guess, and then there will be a comment period and a final rule. So please keep in mind, everything we're talking about today, we're just talking about draft language that the department presented and was negotiated last week, which means, of course, per this first column, in the weeks and months to come, things could change. There are live links throughout this presentation. So if you have the PDF handy, which hopefully is in our resources bucket, you can take a look at that. If it's not there or you can't get it, let us know and we will happily provide you with a copy. The key idea here is there are live links throughout and you can click on those to get to the underlying resources. Also, we have our magic QR code here at the end. We have a website, we call it Regucation. It's sort of our platform for all the resources that we make available for free to the higher education community. And if you scan that QR code, it will take you there, or you can click that little link in the third column. Here is the syllabus for today. So this is a debrief. First, I want to just talk to you about the Head Committee a little bit and give you some sense of what that committee is about, its composition, what it was tasked with doing. Then we'll get into the week 1 topic breakdown. And by that, we're just going to look quickly at the topics for discussion that were presented to the negotiators. And then we're going to get into some of the substantive piece. I want to talk about loss of Pell eligibility, which is the one piece of this that is sort of outside of workforce Pell, and then we'll get into workforce Pell. And first I have a section called level setting where I want to just go through some key foundational points that are really important to understand. And then we'll get into some of the regulatory considerations that were in front of the committee. So let's get moving. Oh, and by the way, we are going to take questions. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end. That is the idea. If you have those questions, you can enter them into the here, and we'll try to get through as many as we can before we get to the end of the hour. So let's start by just talking about the Head Committee. Oh, even before that, let me just take a step back and say, if you are interested in tracking negotiated rulemaking, whether that be the RISE committee that met twice earlier this year, the Head Committee's meeting now and again in January, I suspect there will be more negotiated rulemakings. We have, I was chatting with someone at the department last week who suggested that they have one, they think they will have one nearly every month, except for February for the foreseeable future. So there's a lot coming. We know accreditation is out there and likely coming around. We know that there will probably be sort of a kitchen sink negotiated rulemaking that might include change in ownership and some other topics. All of that is here on this webpage. And when the department releases materials throughout the negotiated rulemaking process, you can sign up and watch the live stream, but you might also like to see the proposals coming in from negotiators, the draft topics that the department has posted. All of that information typically would be available here, assuming there's not a government shutdown or something like that. So you can get pretty into the process. You know, I would say focus on the things the department has made available. If you see a proposal from a negotiator you like to read, you can always do that. But I think we set a record last week. The department said they received over 80 proposed languages or proposals with language, et cetera, from the negotiators around the table. So it's a lot to try to digest if you're not doing this full time, so to speak. But all that information is here. If you're interested in negotiated rulemaking, this is the place to start. So the way negotiated rulemaking works, if you're not familiar, the department actually brings folks around a table right now physically, and for the foreseeable future physically in DC. And each of those folks represent a different constituency that the department has identified that it wants represented at the table. The composition of the folks around the table is important to, the department's thoughtful about this, and you will want to be thoughtful about it when you're thinking about how a neg reg might play out. What you can see here, there is some method to the madness. So the 3 navy blocks, these are folks who represent largely student and former student interests and legal aid. You've got the 3 green, those each represent different types of institutions. For this negotiated rulemaking, we had a number of folks who represented agencies. So you see state authorizing and accrediting agencies are represented, as well as state workforce and state education financing. I think because workforce Pell was a big part of this particular negotiated rulemaking, the department wanted a number of folks around the table who really had experience managing workforce style programs. So, for example, the gentleman who was sitting just to my right, who represented state workforce agencies, actually stood up Virginia's very successful Fast Forward program. He was able to bring a lot of knowledge to the table about how that program worked. And also the department created a couple of buckets here that are sort of outliers. One is for employers and the other is for organizations representing taxpayers and the public interest. And so far, the department has been filling that slot, both at this negotiated rulemaking and the one before, with folks who are sort of economists and think about these types of things from a data and economy standpoint. The names of the primary and alternate negotiators. So I should say for each one of those constituencies represented, there are 2 people appointed. One is the primary negotiator who sits at the table, and then there's an alternate who sits behind them in the room. And that person can agree that the alternate might jump in if the topic is one where the alternate has more experience, or more generally, if the primary is unable to attend or is ill or something like that, the alternate is there to step in so the negotiations don't get stopped. You can go again to the department's website, pull up this document, and see the persons who have been assigned to each one of these constituencies. For private nonprofit institutions, if you're on today, you probably know this because we sent you 3 or 4 emails saying it. I was appointed to represent private nonprofit institutions at the table as the primary negotiator. Also, my bucket includes private nonprofit tribal institutions and HBCUs. There is someone representing public institutions, so public HBCUs would be represented by that person. And then the alternate negotiator, the person I worked closely with and who did a wonderful job and I've gotten to know a little bit, is Joanna Rush from Liberty University. And I should say, you may have noticed one of the constituencies not represented here is financial aid officers, which historically, it is typically the case that they have their own box. So you would have a couple of people who have financial aid experience. And I think a lot of folks that was a head scratcher because a lot of the things that were discussed by RISE and by us last week are fairly financial aid intensive. The good news is there are people representing these constituencies who have financial aid experience. Joanna actually has, I think, 15 or 20 years of experience as a financial aid professional in her career. And then also a couple of the folks, one representing proprietary institutions, and also the gentleman representing state education financing organizations, had a lot of experience with FA and had been financial aid professionals at one point in their life. So we did have some real financial aid expertise at the table, which was good because it was needed. Here are the issues in the broadest sense that the committee is tasked with negotiating. This includes last week and the upcoming negotiated a week of rulemaking that we'll engage in January. Oh, by the way, this is the full acronym for the HEAD Committee, the Accountability in Higher Education and Access Through Demand-Driven Workforce Pell Committee. Makes you wonder who sits around and comes up with these acronyms. So the 3 big buckets. One was loss of Pell eligibility for students who receive grant or scholarship aid exceeding their cost of attendance. This is out of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OB3. This is a new provision. As is the second bullet, the establishment of regulations to manage the distribution of Pell Grants to eligible workforce programs. That was the big topic we really discussed this past week, although we did both of these first 2 bullets last week. And then in January, we'll come back and get to the last bullet on this page, which is changes to actually, I think the bullets disappeared here. There should be a bullet there. Changes to accountability measures, including loss of loan eligibility for certain programs with low earnings outcomes, and also sort of there's a new accountability concept in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that's now in statute, and that needs to be reconciled with this existing financial value transparency and gainful employment regulation. By the way, if you're tuning in today and you are expecting me to talk about accountability, I do not intend to disappoint, but that is not what we discussed in week one. So the way that the department decided to approach things is we would talk about everything not accountability in week one. So we talked about the first two bullets here, mainly Pell eligibility and workforce Pell issues. And in week two, which will occur in January, we're going to focus entirely on accountability, right? Oh, here you go. So week one was last week. Again, talked about Pell Grants. And week two, the second session is dedicated to accountability measures. Protocols are important when you talk about negotiated rulemaking, and they can change from one administration to the next, or even from one rulemaking to the next. So a couple of things to know if you're not that familiar with this process. A negotiated rulemaking committee like ours reaches consensus. This is the key term, consensus, when all negotiators agree to draft regulatory language that's been proposed by the department. Now, the department's approach to consensus has varied over the years. Sometimes the agency has said, we are going to ask for a consensus vote across every topic that we discuss across the entire rulemaking. I was previously a negotiator in 2017, and that's what we did. We had 3 weeks of negotiation, and we covered 11 or 12 topics: bar defense, financial responsibility, closed school loan discharge, a lot of different topics. And we were asked to vote on everything at the very end. And the department only agreed to be bound by consensus if we said yes to everything that had been proposed across the whole 3 weeks. During the Biden administration, the department decided we're going to take consensus on each individual topic during some of their negotiated rulemaking. So that gave the negotiators the flexibility, for example, to say, well, we're not there on eight topics, but we're there on the 9th. And the department would say, okay, well, we're not bound on the first 8, but we are bound on the 9th because you agreed to consensus. This time around, I've never seen this before. It's almost like we have 2 independent rulemakings that are happening for the head committee. So the first week I mentioned, we talked about all the Pell issues, and the department said, we're going to ask for a consensus vote at the end of this week. And if you agree on all the topics covered this week around Pell, we'll consider consensus to have been achieved, and we will be bound without regard to what you may do in week 2. So then we're going to come back in January. We're going to talk about accountability. We're not going to get into Pell. Pell's already done. And spoiler alert, we did reach consensus. I'll get to that in a couple of slides. So now we're going to get to accountability. And if we don't reach consensus on accountability, that won't impact the fact that we did reach consensus on the Pell issues. Okay. Ed typically agrees in all of these contexts, once it's sort of set out its protocols, that if you reach consensus within the parameters that it has dictated, that it will be bound and use that consensus language as the basis for its proposed rule. If the committee does not reach consensus, like in our case, if we had not reached consensus last week on the Pell language, the department would be free to draft any proposed rule it wanted without regard to what may have been discussed during the rulemaking. And what that means is you typically have a dynamic where the department starts with an idea, and over the course of the rulemaking, certain concessions or changes might be made. And what happens is the negotiators get to the end of the period, whatever that period may be, and then they have to make a decision. Do we want to reach consensus and lock in the department, or would we rather roll the dice and let the department come up with something on its own? And it really depends on the constituency you're representing and where the department started and where it has sort of given or not given over the period of the negotiation. But ultimately, negotiators have a decision to make. And that is, again, do I want to lock in the department and keep the concessions I've received? Or do I want to not lock in the department and roll the dice that I'll get something even better if the department is left to its own devices? Ed stipulated that the head committee would vote for consensus at the end of each week. I mentioned this. Okay, so on Friday of the first week, this is the outcome. The head committee did reach consensus with regard to the issues relating to Pell Grants, which I spoiled a second ago. The draft language you can find if you click that link. This is the last set of draft language that's been released by the department. It was posted at 11:30 on Friday. And this is the draft language that we, the negotiators, voted on. The department has indicated that they would create sort of a version of this where all the changes have been accepted and the things have, it's been cleaned up and the highlighting's out. Right now, what you're going to get is literally a document that we were looking at, and it still had highlighting and all these things in it. But it's more or less there, and you can see the language that was agreed to and served as the basis for our consensus vote and should serve as the basis for the department's proposed rule going forward. I mentioned Ed can determine to issue two separate proposed rules, or maybe I hadn't mentioned that yet. And this is an important idea to keep in mind. So we reach consensus on the Pell stuff. We might not reach consensus on accountability. The department is not required to issue like one big proposed rule that covers every topic that might have been considered during a rulemaking. We've seen, in fact, in very recent years, that sometimes the department might consider 10 topics during a rulemaking, and then you might get 3 or 4 different federal registers with 3 or 4 different proposed rules covering different combinations, right? So in this case, it's really important to keep in mind we reached consensus on this first topic, and that has to be the basis more or less of the department's proposed rule. But, and this is a really important point I want to make sure everybody is aware of, once public comment to the public rule, the department will issue its proposed rule, notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, and it'll be open for public comment to 30 to 60 days, right? Once that public comment is received, the department's obligated to look through it, and then it can change the final rule based on the public comment. And that could be in a way that differs from the consensus language we agreed to during NEGREG. So I just want to be really clear. The fact that we reached consensus last week does not mean that you no longer have a reason to comment on the proposed rule, right? The department's got to use our language as the basis for its proposed rule, but you might see something that doesn't make sense or with which you disagree, and you could comment on that during the public comment period, and the department could change it in the final rule. So this is a really important point. Sometimes I'm afraid people think that if a committee reaches consensus, well, this is the final rule and there's no more opportunity for input, and that's not true. Your public comment still has a very valuable function. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so that's sort of the AHEAD committee. Let's move into what we talked about last week. First of all, these are the department issues provides the negotiators with what they'll call historically issue papers or topic papers in advance. Sometimes those include draft regulatory language, sometimes they don't. In our case, they included an entire package of draft regulatory language, and I think that is the direction the department and certainly this administration have been moving in recent years. So I sort of divided, there were 7 topics, but they really got split into 2 big areas. And you'll see these 2 areas are the first 2 bullets from that earlier slide where I said there were sort of 3, categorically speaking, 3 big buckets we were negotiating here. So the first is loss of Pell eligibility, and that was just the first topic, right? The other 6 topics were all in the workforce Pell bucket. So we talked about loss of Pell eligibility, certainly important, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but most of the negotiated rulemaking was dedicated to thinking about workforce Pell. All right, so let's talk about loss of Pell eligibility really quickly. So, and the next point I want to make, this is a super important point too. So the last time the Higher Education Act was reauthorized was in 2008. That was 17 years ago. In almost all of the negotiated rulemakings since then, right? So that's the Obama administration, Trump 1, the Biden administration, with rare exception, the rules that have been negotiated have not been the product of some change in statute, because the statute, the Higher Education Act, has not changed, right? For the most part. I mean, there are a couple of tiny exceptions, 90-10, et cetera, but for the most part, it's just been the department with each successive administration saying, we want to revisit our own rules. And what that means is when the negotiators, and that was the case in 2017 when I did this previously, but what that means is when the negotiators in that type of context sit down, almost anything's on the table. I mean, the department has an idea what it wants to do, but you're not responding to a new statutory directive. That is not the case right now. So for the RISE negotiated rulemaking and now for the AHEAD negotiated rulemaking, for the first time in 17 years, we are responding to direction from Congress. And what that means is, and this is a really important point to understand, the negotiators aren't sitting down with the department and saying, what do we think this should be? What the negotiators are doing is they're sitting down with the department and they're saying, here's what Congress said we have to do. What do we need to clarify, or what type of regulatory package do we need to put around this statutory concept so that it works and can be implemented? So it's a very different exercise. And I want to just be clear. Some of this is a little CYA too. Honestly, I'm concerned people are going to get to some of these concepts in workforce Pell and say, why did the negotiators agree to all of this? You have to keep in mind, a lot of it's in statute. We weren't agreeing. It was already there. And we were just trying to define terms and put something around it that would make as much sense of it as possible. Okay, so I'll highlight that for you here. But first, let's talk about loss of Pell eligibility. So in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OB3, the statutory language says that beginning on July 1st, 2026, a student is no longer eligible for Pell if, quote, for any period for which the student receives grant aid from non-federal sources, including states, institutions of higher education or private sources in an amount that equals or exceeds the student's cost of attendance for such period. And by the way, for the financial aid folks, the department did articulate during NEGREG that this is the student's specific cost of attendance for each student, right? Okay, so what did we feel like we needed to draw out, define, clarify with regard to this statutory language? So the draft text, to which we all agreed, clarifies that the loss of eligibility, first of all, occurs for any award year during which the grant or scholarship assistance exceeds the student's cost of attendance for the award year. It also excludes from consideration sources of aid that are excluded under a particular section of the HA, which include things like Social Security Administration benefits and emergency benefits, et cetera, which should be excluded, right? This concept was very important, though, to us, and the department led with it in their draft regulation. So the draft regulatory text also provides an institution with an opportunity to adjust the grant scholarship assistance. So I think as a practical matter, what you're really expecting is you'll have situations where you come in and you do, schools call this a different thing, but sort of a tuition plan or, a tuition concept for the student where you build out everything you expect with regard to their aid. And you would include Pell in that, right? So you'd say, okay, we think you're eligible for a Pell grant. We think you're going to get outside resources that are going to be equal to this amount. And at the time you're doing that, if those outside resources on their own. Oh, this is another important point. Keep in mind, when we say that the total of grants and scholarships has to exceed the cost of attendance, that means without the Pell Grant, right? Let me say that again. So when you're determining whether the total amount of non-federal assistance that's included here for consideration exceeds the student's cost of attendance, we don't mean with the Pell Grant included. We mean without the Pell Grant. Right? So if a program is $10,000 and you have a total of non-federal grant scholarship assistance of $11,000, the student wouldn't be eligible for a Pell Grant. But in that circumstance, it's always going to be the case that you have enough outside aid to cover the entire cost of attendance, not just tuition fees, the whole cost of attendance, right? But if there's a circumstance where you have packaged the student, you said, yes, they get the Pell Grant, and you say the outside aid is not expected to exceed the total cost of attendance. And then at some point after you make that decision, you draw the Pell, the student receives additional non-federal assistance such that the total now exceeds the cost of attendance. There's an opportunity to make an adjustment. That's what the regulation specifies. So it says, if prior to the final disbursement of a student's Pell Grant award for an award year, the institution becomes aware that the grant scholarship assistance on its own, not including the Pell Grant, on its own will exceed the student's cost of attendance, it can reduce the grant scholarship assistance so the student can keep the Pell, right? So if you've got institutional aid in there, you could reduce that amount of institutional aid. I could see a situation theoretically where the non-federal assistance is all from an outside source, so you might have to work with that outside source to try to pull that back down. And then theoretically, if you return the Pell Grant, right, and then it turned out that additional assistance didn't come in, you could always go back out within the 180-day time frame and pull the Pell Grant back. So there is some flexibility here. But if no adjustment is made or can be made, even if the total of that non-federal assistance only exceeds the cost of attendance by $1, you have to return the Pell Grant. That's the deal, right? And there's going to be more sub-regulatory guidance from the department that's going to sort of walk through different scenarios and help clarify all of this in terms of like the practical application. Okay, so this brings us to our first secret word, which, consistent with our holiday theme, is holly. So please select the correct word below, and it is item C is holly. And I will say I have a holly tree in my backyard, which is colorful this time of year, but most of the year just drops very unpleasant leaves onto my back lawn. I don't know who planted it there, but it is true that when the snow is out and the holly is in the dead of winter glowing, it's a nice sight to see. So I'll give you guys just a couple more seconds. Please select holly if you are looking to get CLE for this program. Holly is item C. All right. C is in cat. I guess we could actually put a word there that starts with C, but what word associated with the holiday season starts with C? I don't know. It would take forever probably to come up with something. So instead we have C for holly. All right, I got a sip of tea. Let's keep going. Workforce Pell. So this was the majority of the conversation. I want to talk to you first a little bit about what this thing is, because I think a lot of folks in higher education probably have some misconceptions And we're going to talk first about just the statutory concept, like what's in statute and how this thing works, and try to clarify some of those concepts. So it's critically important to understand, and this was something that I actually asked for clarification on day one. It's critically important to understand that Workforce Pell is not a new type of financial aid product. It's not in addition to or apart from the regular Pell Grant program. It's not going to be independently funded. Workforce Pell is simply making the existing Pell Grant available to a shorter class of programs, which are eligible workforce programs. So let me say that again, because this is a super important foundational concept. We have not created a new category of financial aid here. What we are doing is we are just taking the Pell Grant, the existing Pell Grant, and we are making it available to students who are in a much shorter program, shorter than any eligible program previously has been, right? That's the deal. But this is just the Pell Grant program being extended to another class of sort of a new class of eligible program. That means the Pell Grants provided to students in an eligible workforce program will be prorated according to standard Pell proration rules. Let me say that again, because this is a super important point. This is just the Pell Grant program. So now you have a really short program. An eligible workforce program has to be less than 15 weeks. 14 weeks is as long as it can be. And the amount of Pell Grant that these students will receive is going to be a prorated version of the Pell Grant, right? According to the standard Pell proration rules. So, and I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, but this is not a concept where Congress has sort of created a new package or new product where they're going to say, you just get $6,000, $7,000 or the cost of the program or something like that. It doesn't work like that. You're getting a prorated amount of the standard federal Pell Grant program. As such, the amount of available Pell is probably going to be less than what a lot of folks were contemplating when we heard talk about short-term Pell or workforce Pell. Let me give you a couple, 3 examples. And by the way, if you click this link, you can bring up this page that the department distributed on day one, which has all of these calculations in detail, right? So per the statute, for example, the longest an eligible workforce program can be under the statute is 599 clock hours over 14 weeks. By the way, it's interesting. Most of the eligible program categories, maybe all of the eligible program categories that currently exist in the law reflected at 34 CFR 668.8 eligible programs, all have minimums, but they don't have maximums, right? They tend to say like a program has to be at least this long, right? It's different here. The idea is that an eligible workforce program has to be within a certain zone. It can't be longer than that either. So the longest one can be to qualify as 599 clock hours over 14 weeks of instruction. In that scenario, and again, the department does the calculation on this sheet, the department indicated that a student's payment would be, by the way, first of all, that's 42 hours of instruction per week, which is clock hours of instruction per week, which is pretty hefty. I guess it's theoretically possible, but that would be a lot of instruction for someone, even for a short-term program. But the key point I want to make here is this is the longest possible program. The department calculated the total award at $3,981. Another example the department offered was the shortest type program. So that would be a program that's 150 clock hours over 8 weeks of instructional time. In this scenario, the department did the calculations and indicated that a student's payment would be $61 and change for each payment period for a total of $123. That's your workforce Pell Grant, right? In the shortest program, it's $123. In a third example, the department took a student enrolled in a program that's 10 semester credit hours with non-standard terms over 10 weeks of instruction. And in that instance, the department calculated the student's payment was $269 and change for the first payment period, $119.89 for the second, for a total of $389. So look, one of the things folks need to understand out of the gates, and by the way, this is based on the statutory construct. This is not something that the negotiators in the department cooked up, right? This is how the thing works. And what that means is for a lot of Pell Grant programs, what you're talking about is $400, $500, $600, $700 towards the program. Okay. Funding could be tight. Because this is part of the standard Pell Grant program, there's not a separate pot of money that Congress is allocating. It just comes out of the federal Pell Grant funding, right? And we already have a projected shortfall of $98 billion in the Pell Grant program by FY 2035. OB3 appropriated an additional $10 billion, but part of the department's consideration too here is, you know, you've got a new class of programs that's eligible, but you don't have a bigger pot of money. In fact, we're already short on that pot of money. So it will be interesting to see how much the funding is available. There is still, everything I've ever heard, continuing bipartisan support for the Pell Grant program is the cornerstone of federal financial aid. I think Congress will come around and continue to appropriate funding to make up the shortfall. But just keep in mind, workforce Pell funding, or Pell funding for eligible workforce programs, which is the way I'm going to say it from now on, because I don't want to, I think when you talk about workforce Pell, it makes it sound like it's a new thing. It's not. It's Pell grants for workforce eligible programs, or eligible workforce programs. So, you know, those programs are getting money from the same pot, right? And there are a bunch of key requirements that are statutory. And I just highlight this, I made the point earlier, but to really stress that neither the department nor the negotiators could change any of this. It's in statute. So our job really was, where there was a lack of clarity surrounding some of these concepts, and some of them are pretty complicated, to try to fill in the blanks, right, and put something around it so that it can actually be operational come July 1 of next year. But what I want to do is I want to talk you through briefly what the statutory framework is for the Workforce Pell Program, and then we can talk about the types of things that the negotiators were considering, right? So per the statute, the department's authorized to begin awarding Pell grants to students in eligible workforce programs effective July 1 of next year. We'll see how many of these programs can get qualified by then. To be eligible, students must meet general Pell eligibility requirements, be enrolled in an eligible workforce program, which is a big part of the conversation, not be enrolled in a program that leads to a graduate credential, and not have obtained a graduate credential. Okay, and by the way, in the lower right-hand corner, the statutory framework for eligible workforce Pell is already in statute, right? I mean, it became law in July when OB3 became law. So you can go right now to Westlaw, or anywhere you can find the USC code in your local markets and neighborhoods, and you can pull up these citations and you'll see the language right in the lower right-hand corner. So the terms and conditions for awarding Pell grants to a student in an eligible workforce program are generally the same as for other Title IV programs, with some exceptions. Non-credit remedial English language instruction and study abroad courses are not eligible. And a student may receive a workforce Pell grant in an amount that is prorated based on the length of the program. And that's the critical point we made earlier, notwithstanding that the amount is less than the minimum Pell grant, because the workforce program is less than an academic year. So again, this is really just about making Pell available to a new class of shorter program. A student cannot simultaneously receive a workforce Pell grant and a regular Pell grant. And any period of study covered by a workforce Pell grant is going to be included when determining the student's overall Pell eligibility. Okay, a program is an eligible workforce program if, and I've started with a summary slide, and then I'm going to expand and dig into these last two bullets because a lot of the complicated stuff sits there. Okay, so first of all, it's a program of at least 150 clock hours of instruction, but less than 600. So we mentioned earlier, the max is 599, right? Or an equivalent number of credit hours, which you would have to subject to the credit clock hour conversion to determine. And it's offered by an eligible institution during a minimum of 8 weeks, but less than 15 weeks. So it has to be between 8 and 14 weeks long. Okay. It can't be a correspondence course, but it can be offered through distance education. We'll talk about some of those wrinkles in a minute. The governor of a state, after consultation with the state board, that's all the statute says, the state board, determines that the program meets additional requirements. It determines that the program meets additional specified requirements. So these last two bullets, let's unpack what is it the governor has to do and what is it the department has to do. And again, this is in statute. So per the statute, the governor has to consult with the state board and determine if the program provides an education aligned with the requirements of high skill, high wage, or in-demand industry sectors or occupations, and meets the hiring requirements of potential employers in those sectors or occupations, and either leads to a recognized post-secondary credential that is stackable and portable across more than one employer, or prepares students for employment in an occupation for which there is only one recognized post-secondary credential and provides that credential upon completion, and prepares students to pursue one or more certificate or degree programs at one or more institutions of higher education, including by ensuring that the student, upon completion of the program, enrollment in the related certificate or degree program, will receive academic credit for the workforce Pell program that will be accepted toward meeting the certificate or degree program requirements, and the acceptability of the credit toward meeting the certificate or degree program requirements. Aaron, why did you put so much text on the page? Why are you reading all of this? It's tiny. It is hurting my eyes. because it's really important to me that folks understand how complicated the statutory construct is. This is what was delivered to the department and the negotiators. And again, that's not really about CYA or anything like that. I just want you all to understand that our starting place here was pretty complicated. Also, during the negotiations, I mean, we sort of recognized that there was some tension here. I mean, if you think about it, the second bullet seems to suggest, the first part of the second bullet suggests that there's an emphasis on stackability and portability. That almost sounds like this is supposed to be a program that leads into another program. The last bullet also says prepare students to pursue one or more certificate or degree programs. That sounds like a pathway program, right? But then if you look at the third bullet, Roman numeral 2, it says it has to prepare a student for employment in an occupation for which there's only one recognized post-secondary credential and provides that credential upon completion. It almost, and then the first two bullets really are focused on high skill, high wage, in demand. It's almost like there's a dual identity here. You've got to create a program that both prepares people to go right into the workforce in a high demand, high skilled, high wage occupation. That sounds like a workforce program, but also is a pathway program and prepares folks to potentially go into another program, which is sort of the traditional academic model, right? We've been creating, non-degree programs that lead to associates and associates that lead to bachelors. That's how higher ed has been creating that sort of stackable concept for years. One thing the department made very clear, and I'm going to get to this, round back to it later, is that they read this to really be about getting people into the workforce. Yes, to become an eligible program, you have to demonstrate to the governor, and the governor has to certify that your program is stackable and that it can prepare someone ultimately, if they want to go back to school, give them credit, they can take somewhere else. But the department's view, and you will see this in the policy and the regulations, is that the most important point of this is to get people right into the workforce. Again, I'm going to come back to this, particularly around calculation of job placement rates. Okay, but once the governor has done all that, you're only halfway there, because then the governor has to certify stuff and send a package to the department along with your application. And at that point, the department also has to make some determinations. They have to, first of all, confirm and the way the regulatory framework worked out, the governor's actually going to do a lot of this work and certify it to the department. But the department, for its part, has to confirm, based on the governor's certification, that your program has been offered by the institution for not less than 1 year prior to this determination date, right? For every award year that you're offering your program, it will be measured. And the program has to have a verified completion rate of at least 70%. And it also has to have a verified job placement rate of at least 70%. And for each award year, the total amount of the published tuition and fees of the program cannot exceed the value added earnings of students as calculated by the department and published to the institution. So there's a lot of stuff in the statute and with which institutions have to comply, keeping in mind that they have to comply with all of these things for potentially $200 or $300 or $400 per student. Not only that, but as you can see here, you're going to be measured on an annual basis. And 70% completion and job placement rate is no joke. In fact, there's an existing category of program in Title IV in 668.8. There's already an existing category of short-term program for which direct loans and other Title IV can be available, right? And that program, if you have one, also has to meet a 70-70 completion placement rate requirement. It's been in the law for many, many years. In my 25 years, I've worked with one client that had that kind of program. So we asked the department, can you tell us how many of those 70-70 programs today are already eligible, not under Workforce Pell, but under this existing short program category, 79. So out of 5,500 institutions of higher education in the United States, tens of thousands of programs, there are currently 79 short-term programs that are satisfying the 70-70 requirement that already sits in the law. That gives you a sense of just how hard this thing is to do and why most institutions haven't gone anywhere near it. To do eligible Workforce Pell, you're going to have to do this. And any year you fail, you're going to be bumped out. What that probably means as a practical matter is that most folks, first of all, you have to run the program for a year. Then you have to get the governor to certify. Then you have to get the department to certify, and you have to meet 70-70 on an ongoing basis. I think schools are going to have to build this to run without Workforce Pell, right? I mean, you got to run it for a year without it. And you have this risk of losing it in any given year if you don't hit that 70% placement and completion requirement. So I think schools will develop programs to ostensibly run without it. And if you get it, great. And you have it while you have it. And then if you lose it, you don't, right? And keep in mind, if you lose eligibility for Workforce Pell, that doesn't mean you can't offer the program. It just means that the students in the program can't get this prorated Pell Grant amount, right? It doesn't mean you're no longer authorized to offer the program in general. And that's an important point. We're just talking about access to Pell Grants under this new category of program. So what on earth did the negotiators talk about last week if all of this stuff is already in statute? Well, there were a lot of questions that we had to work through. I mean, first of all, which state board must the governor consult? Now, this is discussed a little bit in statute, so we were able to pull from that statutory language, and the department had already put that in its draft text. It's the state workforce development board. So it's not the state authorizing board. It's not your state portal entity for SARA. It's the workforce development board established under Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Okay, if my program is online, would I have to obtain approval from the governor in every state, right? So you may have your program authorized in your home state. You may be participating in SARA, by virtue of NC SARA. If it's a professional licensure program, you may already be going through the rigmarole of getting the professional licensure requirements met in every state. But what about if you've designed it to be eligible for workforce Pell? So yes, eligible workforce programs offered through distance education would have to obtain approval from the governor in every state in which they enroll students if they want to disperse Pell Grants to students in that eligible workforce program, right? And that sits outside of SARA. It sits outside of the professional licensure regulations and accreditation. So what that means is for each eligible workforce program that you offer, you're going to have to be authorized by the state in which you're offering the program in any other states where you're enrolling students. Maybe you can leverage SARA, depending on who you are. You're going to have to be accredited. The program has to be accreditation. The department confirmed that. Has to be accredited, which the department confirmed. You're going to have to comply with the rules applicable to professional licensure programs if your eligible workforce Pell program happens to be a professional licensure program under that section of the regulations. And in addition to all of that, in any state where you want to offer Pell based on your status as an eligible workforce Pell program, you're also going to have to go through the approval process with that governor. Now, that being said, the draft regulations, we talked about this, and the department agreed and included in the draft regulations for the allowance of bilateral agreements among the states. So the department wasn't willing to go so far as to say, we think that it's okay if you just create sort of a SARA concept around this too. And the reasoning was because a big part of eligible workforce programs is the governor saying, in our state, this particular program is high wage and high need. And they just felt like if you get approved in just your home state and you're beaming this program to students sitting in all different parts of all different states, it may not be that that criteria is met in all those other states. And they didn't want to set something up where you could just sort of bypass that, because that's at the core of the statutory framework. But what they said is we also don't, we understand this is challenging, though. We do want folks to be able to get this to market. So it's sort of a halfway effort to say, okay, well, if a state, if I'm Missouri, where I'm sitting today, and I want to work something out with Kansas, so folks in Kansas right next door can also take this program, we can work that out. If you're in Virginia and DC and Maryland, they want to create some opportunity, but they don't want to go so far as a sort of a state authorization type construct. The other thing that's really important, and I asked this question specifically to the department, they've indicated that an institution would still be able to offer the eligible workforce program to students in states where approval has not been granted by that governor. They just can't get the Pell Grant. Now, that may seem sort of, oh, well, sure, that makes sense, Aaron, but think about this for a minute. I can't think of any other context where that would be true. If you are talking about baseline state authorization, for example, and let's say you're not a SARA participating institution, if you're not authorized in the state where that student is located, you can't offer the program to them. Full stop, right? You can't do that. If you have a professional licensure program, this is one of the changes the Biden administration made, and if you haven't, concluded that your program will meet the requirements for professional licensure in another state, you can't enroll students in that state into the program. You can't just get a disclaimer or disclosure from them. You can't enroll them. Here, what the department is saying is I could have an online program offered in 40 states, and if I've received approval in 6 of those states, then the students located in those states, it's one academic program, one Title IV eligible program, and I'm going to be offering Pell to only a division of students or a certain grouping of students within a single program. That's different. I mean, to my knowledge, that's pretty atypical in the way that financial aid and the regulatory constructs are usually presented. So I thought this was, and this is important because what we didn't want to do is disincentivize folks from even going for workforce Pell, right? Because my argument to the department was, if I've got someone who has scaled up, because you got to run it for a year before you could go for workforce Pell. Let's say that they've introduced a program, it's a good program, they scaled it up and it's available in 40 different states, right? And then they get approval in 6 of those states for workforce Pell. If the department were to say, then you can't offer it in the other 34, for $300 or $400 a student, that person might just say, well, then we're just not going to do workforce Pell, right? We'll just offer it in the 40 states without Pell because it's been designed and run that way for a year. And I think the department understood that, among other things, and for that reason, took the position that they did. Would I really have to run an eligible workforce program without Pell for a year before it can be approved by the governor? Aaron, you said this multiple times. Yes, the governor would have to certify to the department, among other things, that an eligible workforce program, quote, currently meets and has met for the 12 months immediately preceding this certification, the core eligibility requirements. But note, and we were very thoughtful about this in committee, this formulation would permit institutions to seek approval of programs that are already in existence, right? So if you've got a program you've been running for 3 or 4 years and it is otherwise eligible for workforce Pell, it fits within the number of weeks and the clock or credit hours, et cetera, you could go to the governor and the governor could certify today, theoretically, that your program has met these requirements for the preceding 12 months. Right. So we wanted to create an opportunity for folks potentially to take programs that are already solid programs, or if you design one and launch it in January, you could get 6 months in, so that it's not as if everyone has to start on July 1 of next year. How would I find out about the governor's approval process? Yeah, great question. And there is some concern that states have very different administrative capabilities and may approach this differently, which may be more access for folks in some states and less access for folks in others. The one thing, and the department was very careful here about not dictating to the states how to make determinations. But what they did in the draft regulations proposed, and we agreed to, is that the governor has to establish its approval process and make it publicly available. And this process has to be robust and the disclosures have to be robust. So it says in the regulatory text, when the governor publishes the process that's made publicly available, has to include lots of different elements, including the approval criteria, methodologies, and timelines, data submission requirements for institutions, and appeal opportunities. Also, the regulations specify that it has to be administered equitably across all institutions. Okay, how about these completion rates? How is this completion rate measured? So for the first 3 award years, 26, 27, 27, 28, and 28, 29, the governor would determine, I say would, I used would throughout this whole presentation because, again, these are draft regulations. Please don't read this and say, oh, Aaron says this is how it works. This is the draft language we agreed to. It should look like this in the proposed rule. It could change between the proposed and final rule. Please just keep that in mind. But the draft text, this is what's contemplated. So for these 3 award years, the governor would determine whether the program has a 70% completion rate with 150% of the normal time to completion. After that award year, it's pretty much the same exercise, but the governor would make this determination as determined under 34 CFR 668.8F. That's the section of the regulations that includes the placement and calculation formulas for those existing short-term programs that I mentioned earlier, of which there are currently 79 in the United States. But that was already sitting in the regs, despite the fact that it is rarely used. So what the department is basically saying is, for the first 3 years, we're going to give governors a little more flexibility. But after that first 3 years goes by, we want them doing this in a manner that's consistent with 668.8F. And there are some exclusions there that governors could adopt over the next 3 award years, but will have to adopt in after 28, 29. And some of those will probably be of interest to institutions. For example, and you don't see this in a lot of accrediting standards, but one of the things that's at 68.8F, if you have a student who withdraws from an eligible workforce program, say you're after the 28, 29 award year, and the governor is required to calculate this rate in accordance with 668.8F. At that point, if you have a student who withdraws and you give them 100% refund, they're pulled out of the completion formula, numerator and denominator. Not a lot of, a lot of accreditation state completion rates don't work that way, right? But it does work that way under 668.8F. So there are some material differences that would occur at that point. Also, per the text that we agreed to, in addition to the exclusions that are in 668.8F, both during the first 3 award years and after, a student is excluded from the completion calculation if the student dies, experiences a medical condition preventing employment, is called into uniformed service, or is incarcerated. So they would just be pulled completely out if for some reason before they completed the program one of these things occurred, or presumably if it occurred maybe after they, after they completed the program, but maybe before it was calculated. I'm not sure about that, but certainly if it occurred prior to them completing the program. Job placement, trickier. So the governor would determine job placement rates using administrative data, including wage records. For the first 3 award years, the calculation would be the percentage of students who are employed during the second quarter after exiting the program. Couple of really important things here. First of all, your job placement is being measured 2 quarters after that student completes that program. So it's very fast, right? The other thing to note is it's after exiting the program. We talked about this at the table very specifically. That doesn't mean they completed the program. So for the first 3 award years, your job placement rate is going to be for everybody who enters the program, whether they drop or whether they complete the program. But, and we brought this up to the department, they said, yes, we understand that cuts against the institution. On the other hand, in the first 3 years, there's no consideration to what type of employment they achieve or whether they're actually being employed in the thing you prepared them for, right? So we're going to measure everybody. States have some flexibility here, and we're not going to require any kind of determination regarding whether the student actually entered a related or in-field occupation. So the department felt like, it's very imprecise in a lot of ways, but that it ought to be a wash at some level. After 28-29, the job placement calculation would be the percentage of students who are employed in the occupation for which the program prepares students or a comparable occupation during the second quarter after completing the program. So there, both things change, right? So now you're only measuring completers, but they have to be in field. A student, again, is excluded from the job placement calculation entirely, numerator and denominator, if the student dies, experiences a medical condition, called into uniformed service, or incarcerated. What you do not see here is an exclusion for further education. So I mentioned earlier that in the statutory construct, an institution to get a program classified as an eligible workforce program, among other things, has to demonstrate that it is a stackable credential and that you can earn credit that can be used and accepted towards another institution, at another institution or at your own, but towards another program. And when this came up, I said, well, wait a minute. What you're telling me is if someone finishes my eligible workforce program and then goes into that other program at my institution or another institution, they're not counted as placed, and that cuts against me for hitting the 70-70. And the department said, yes, and here is why. Notwithstanding the statutory language, our view is that the purpose of these programs is to get people into the workforce, and we don't want to create an incentive for institutions to push people into longer programs. So in addition to designing a program that can function without Pell for a year and ostensibly function without Pell if it blows 70-70, you also are going to want to design a program that is really intended to put people directly into the workforce. You have to make sure that they, satisfy that stackable concept and that credit can be used at your institution or another for another program. But the department's notion is that would be years down the road. And this is not, so don't design eligible workforce programs that are intended to put people right into another program at your institution or another institution. If you do that, it's going to tank your job placement calculation. So please be advised. How will outcomes be measured for new programs? Recall eligible workforce programs have to be in existence for a year before they can be certified. So in theory, after that year, some data might be available. That said, the department is able to waive outcomes requirements if it determines to measure under a different concept. That flexibility is in the draft regulation. Also, in the case of job placement rates, the department would be able to waive the outcomes if the governor needs an additional award year to make the certification. And the idea really was, if you've run the program for a year, but the data is just not available, there's some flexibility to run it for another year before you're really held to this outcome standard. What would happen if a program's outcomes fail? The program would become ineligible at the end of the payment period that begins after the date the department determines that the institution failed to meet the outcome requirement. This is important because what this really means is the longest an eligible workforce program would be 2 payment periods. So if you blow 70-70 in the first of 2 payment periods, what this means is the program doesn't become ineligible until everyone who's in the program at the time you find out you blew the 70-70 has had the opportunity to graduate out of the program. right? So we prevent a situation where, they can't get into the second pay period. Let's talk about value-added earnings. I know we got 6 minutes. I'm going to stick around and finish this, but I understand I'll do my best to compress this. So value-added earnings is the last sort of tricky piece to all of this. And it is an accountability concept in a sense. What the idea is for each award year, in eligible workforce programs, total published tuition and fees can't exceed this value-added earnings cap, which is the value-added earnings of students who are working, received a Pell Grant for enrollment in the program, and completed the program during the cohort period. The cohort period is the award year that ended 3 full award years prior to the beginning of the award year for which the value-added earnings are being determined. So practically speaking, this means earnings would be measured probably in the first tax year following the end of the award year during which the students graduated. Very complicated, I know. I've tried to include a visual here at the bottom just to give you a sense of the temporal relationships. But you can see for 29-30, if that's the award year for which the value-added earnings are being determined, then under this definition of cohort period, we're talking about students who completed in 25-26, and we're probably measuring their earnings from 2027 because the department thinks that's probably the earliest or the most recent earnings year. If you're in 29-30, that they would be able to pull would be tax year 2027. How would the cap be applied? So what's interesting is this isn't, the idea here is it's not like an eligibility requirement. The notion isn't that you have to demonstrate that you have a certain amount of value add in order to maintain eligibility. What they're saying is we're going to calculate a number and your tuition and fees can't exceed that number. So here's how they calculate the number. They say, no later than let me answer the question that's on the screen. How would the value-added earnings cap be applied? No later than 3 months prior to the beginning of an award year, the department's going to publish your value-added earnings cap for each program that would apply, right? And so as an institution, you just have to lower your tuition fee. I don't mean to make it sound easy, but just so you understand the concept here, your obligation is you've got 3 months to lower your tuition and fees so that satisfies this number. So it's not an eligibility requirement. It's a way of capping the tuition and fees you can charge for the program. If a workforce program loses eligibility, how long would it be out? Okay, so this is sort of the last thing is on regaining eligibility. It depends on the reason for the loss of eligibility. If the loss is due to the governor pulling the certification, all that stuff the governor has to certify if they say this program no longer meets all these requirements, or you've exceeded the value-added earnings cap. So if you got your information from the department and said, I don't care, I'm still going to charge more, then really it's just a matter of how long it would take you to correct that. So you would have to lower your tuition and fees to come under the value-added earnings cap, or you'd have to go to the governor and try to remedy whatever the governor thought was preventing you from being certified on a go-forward basis, right? Now, if the loss is due to outcomes, there is a 2-year waiting period. This also applies to any substantially similar program, but we negotiated this and we think this is really important for institutions and will be important in January as a precedent. Historically, under the financial value transparency and gainful employment frameworks, this concept of a substantially similar program was any program that shared the same 4-digit zip code. We had a lot of conversation with the department and gave a lot of examples as to why that was just too broad a brush, right? Particularly like allied health fields where you just, you could have a theoretically a yoga instructor workforce eligible program. If it lost eligibility, you can't roll out, a EMT program. And these are just radically different concepts. And we were able to demonstrate a lot of those kinds of things. I think that's a valid example, by the way, but if somebody looks that up and it's wrong, don't hold me to it. But that's conceptually the idea, is that it's too broad a brush. And so we said, well, how about this? How about 2 things have to be true? One, it has to be within that same 4-digit SIP root, but also the corresponding SOC codes. In other words, if you put that SIP into the SOC crosswalk for the program that lost eligibility and the program I want to start, and they're in the same 4-digit SIP code, but then we put each of the 6-digit SIPs in the SOC crosswalk. If they don't produce identical occupations, then I should be able to start this program. Because what that means is there are occupations that are different from the program that's ineligible, and I should be able to launch this program. And the Department of the Negotiators all agreed to it. We think this is a real improvement over the straight 4-digit SIP, and we hope to see this come up and this idea be carried forward in the accountability discussion in January. All right, here's your second secret word today. Second secret word came in just under the wire, but I will stick around and try to do 10, 15 minutes here and try to answer questions. I'm going to ask my producer what to put in the box. I think we have 10 minutes maybe before we get bumped. So if I suddenly just stop talking and everything disappears, you'll know we've exceeded our time. The secret word is jolly. My producer says we have time, so we have time. The secret word is jolly. That's A. So please be sure to select A. Take a minute here and hit A, jolly. I want to make sure if you're an attorney type and you're trying to pick up your CLE that you can do that. All right, so take just another minute here to choose A, secret word, jolly. I'm watching the percentage responded. Usually have a pretty good idea when most of you guys have had a chance. And by the way, this is I think pretty much the last substantive slide of the presentation. I got one more slide to show you and then we'll go right into questions. So we got it in under 60 minutes, but didn't have enough time for questions without going over. All right, I hope everybody had a chance there to select. Here we go. Oh, this is the last slide. Here's the magic QR code. All of our stuff is here, including links to webinars like this one. I'll also note the litigation summaries that we update once a month. Really good stuff if you have a chance to go check that out. Okay. So let's look at questions. I'll leave this up so you can scan that QR code if you like. And I'm going to scroll back to the beginning. Do you have resources you could share on the RISE committee? Yes, we did webinar. We did. I wasn't on that committee, but we had people in the room every day. And on our YouTube channel, if you scan this thing, go where it says webinar training resources, eventually you'll get to our YouTube channel. We house everything. We did 2, I'll call them straight to YouTube videos. They weren't live webinars where we debriefed each week of the RISE. I would just go to the second one where we talk about the professional degree question and some of the other things that were discussed. So there are some resources available on our platform. And then if you go to the NEGREG page I cited earlier, all the RISE resources that were used by the committee, I believe are there. I know there was a delay in getting them up because of the government shutdown, but I believe that they're all there now. So you can see all the proposals that went in and the department's draft regulatory language, et cetera, around RISE. All right. Could you elaborate on how a person gets appointed to sit on well, okay, so this says on an NPRM committee. So let me distinguish between 2 things. Not to nitpick, but you have negotiated rulemaking committees where the department, which I talked about at the outset, proposes usually issues and draft language, and there's a discussion and they try to come to consensus on draft language. Then the department, if there's consensus, for example, will take that language and it will put together a proposed rule. That proposed rule is the NPRM, right? And then that goes in the Federal Register. Then you have an opportunity to comment on that during a 30 to 60-day period typically, and then the department publishes its final rule. But if you're talking about how do you participate in NEGREG, it varies. I mean, a lot of times, a lot of trade associations will offer up. The department usually puts out, I think they did for both of these, a public solicitation for nominations. And anybody can nominate anybody. You can nominate yourself, and you can just submit it to the department through its website or it's at the appropriate email address. Yeah, they did for both of these. They were out there. I do remember now. But as a practical matter, the department is typically associations or large institutions with particular stakes and a topic that. So I'm going to make this up, but certainly if there are 6 or 7 really large trade organizations inside the Beltway that represent private, nonprofit, and public institutions, right? So their nominations are always taken very seriously. Proprietary institutions have a couple or 3 different trade associations with lots and lots of members, and they'll nominate people. But let's say you had a negotiated rulemaking very specifically around distance education, and again, I'm making this up. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but there are a handful of very large institutions in the country, Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire University, Maryland, Liberty University, that have really large enrollments. So the department might look at one of those and say, well, these guys, Arizona, University of Arizona, say these guys are very big in the space, and maybe we should look at whoever they nominated. But it's sort of through that process, right? That nomination process. Let's see. What obligation, if any, does the department have to consider negotiated rulemaking comments? In the past, the department has followed procedure with little consideration for comments. Well, I'm not sure if you mean comments that are floated, again, we're sort of conflating negotiated rulemaking and the proposed rule. So most of the department in this case, for example, had sort of an open call for comments and suggestions prior to the negotiated rulemaking. If people wanted to sort of make suggestions to the department about how it should approach creating this draft regulation. And then you have the negotiated rulemaking itself, where people sit around the table and talk about, the draft regulatory language. Then you have that proposed rule that goes in the Federal Register, and then folks can comment on the record to the proposed rule. I think you can move the needle at every one of these points. You can also schedule meetings with OMB. You can try to schedule meetings sometimes with the department directly. I think it's all critically important. If Congress has said we're going to create a new workforce Pell program, and the department creates a regulatory package around it, and your comment is you should get rid of workforce Pell programs, you're probably not going to get what you want, right? But we have many times, like our law firm, on behalf of other organizations, have highlighted for the department issues or concerns in public comment or at other points, and we've seen those things taken in and changes made. And when the department issues the final rule, they'll actually go through and say, we agree with this, we don't agree with that. Now, look, make no mistake, I don't mean to sound Pollyannish. I mean, the department certainly can take a look at your proposal, and I've seen them do this in the final rule preambles, and they'll say, yes, we understand these issues were raised, and we're not persuaded. It just sort of, they can be dismissive. But we have also seen many examples of the department hearing what people have to say. And the important point I always try to make is the department has like 30 people in the room, one administration to the next. It's always the case. There's like 30 people in the room. They're experienced. A lot of them are very smart, but they don't see everything. And many times what's just incredibly valuable is that practitioners, folks at institutions and students alike and others, they understand or see something in a proposal that the department has not recognized, and they'll highlight that for the department. And the department will say, oh, we didn't realize that this would have this adverse effect. And we have seen that move the needle. So please, I just beg of you, don't think that it is that there's no merit to participating in this process. There is great merit to participating in the process. You're not always going to get what you want, but the quote, the great Wayne Gretzky, who supposedly said this, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And my advice is take the shots. And I think you will have an opportunity sometimes to see some real success. Let's see. Based on the draft consensus language, was there any clarification to whether states are required to have programs up and running by July 1st, 2026? I don't think the department can't, and they talked about this a number of times, and I think this is true. The department can't tell states how fast to move or require them to get up and running. I mean, the best the department could do would be to try to waive the approval required of the governor if they wanted to, and I don't see them doing that. I think if they want this to be successful, they're going to need to reach out to states and try to support them and help them along. I think states are going to get lots of feedback from institutions and employers who are interested in these programs. But, it's really going to be a function of how quickly the governors can get things running. And keep in mind, that's what Congress said. That wasn't left up to the department. That wasn't the department's decision. Congress requires that the governors reach certain decisions and certify, and the department requires the certification to move forward. I mean, again, there's a little flexibility around certain things like the outcomes measurements the department can waive early on, or give a little more flexibility around. Value-added earnings won't be available until you have graduates. So the first handful of years, there's sort of a gap between the value until the value-added earnings cap starts to be made available. The department did say it would try to predict for folks what that's going to be to the best of its ability, just to avoid a situation where institutions price a program and run it for 3 or 4 years, and the department gets back to them and it turns out they're way over. So there's going to be some effort because that's not good for anybody. But the truth of the matter is that you're going to have these governors and their state boards, the WIO boards, sort of get this thing up and running. And I think it's a very legitimate concern that some states will probably get it done. I know a few are already working on it and others may not. I did go through, though, and the big thing that states really have to do is get the policy process all together and publish it, and then start running the numbers, right? I don't mean to make it sound like that's not much, but I think, if you can get some smart people who spend some time with this for a week, they can probably craft this stuff pretty quickly, and then they can start trying to get it out there. I don't think it has to take 6 months to decipher, but I don't mean to be dismissive of the concern. It certainly is a legitimate concern. Let's see here. In finalizing a rule, how far can Ed deviate from the proposed rule? That's interesting. I mean, theoretically, they could deviate a great deal, but typically they try not to propose something they don't want to. I mean, they're going to propose something they're interested in doing, and they have to be responsive to the comments. So I'll just say, let's say theoretically, the department said, we propose to do A, and every comment they received was supportive of A, and then they rescinded A. I mean, I think that would create some exposure for them, because how would you argue that that was responsive to comment? But let's say the department said, we want to do A, this thing, and they received 80% of the comments said this is a really bad idea and gave reasons why. The department could just say, okay, well, this is not a good idea and we're not going to do it. And, you could have a really short, discrete rulemaking where there were only 4 or 5 things even proposed. So I think there's a fair amount of flexibility there. There is statutory language around negotiated rulemaking in the U.S. Code, also the Administrative Procedures Act, and some of these concepts come into play. But I think there's a lot of flexibility there. I don't know if that's been tested. I don't know if there's case law out there on that point. Does the loss of Pell eligibility have any potential implications for last dollar free tuition programs in states? Would non-federal aid sources have to be packaged first? Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. The department kept talking about how this doesn't change the idea that Pell is still first dollar. And I think when this statutory language came out, a lot of people, myself included, sort of asked the questions like, is this flipping the traditional model on the head? And I think the idea is, the expectation is that institutions will, kind of what I said earlier, they're going to look at what they understand that the student is able to receive. Keep in mind, these are short programs. So this is not like a 4-year program where there's could be a lot of fluctuation where aid is coming from over 4 years, right? I mean, this is a 14-week program max. And so hopefully you've got a pretty solid idea of where the funding is coming from. But what the department is really saying is, look, you package it. And like if the kid's got an athletic scholarship, which I don't know why that would be the case for an eligible workforce program, but theoretically, actually, you know what? I just made a mistake, and I want to call this out and make sure that others don't make it. This restriction about Pell eligibility and non-federal assistance exceeding cost of attendance is not exclusive to eligible workforce programs. It is just a Pell program concept. And I made this mistake right now. It's easy to do because 99% or 95% of what we were talking about was eligible workforce Pell. But let me just take a step back. That's not what this is about. This is just Pell in general, right? And I think what I've heard is that a big part of what Congress was thinking about was like athletic scholarships and full ride scholarships, where everything is taken care of, right? So I think the expectation is institutions will have some sense, at least at the beginning of the award year, right, as to whether or not when they package, a student is going to have enough aid to totally exceed all of cost of attendance. Because remember, it's the non-federal assistance without the Pell Grant considered has to exceed cost of, not just even tuition fees, everything, cost of attendance, right? But I think the idea is if you do that initial packaging and the student doesn't have that kind of aid and they qualify for the Pell Grant, you package them for the Pell Grant, right? So even if you're talking about like, state aid or something like that being in the mix, that would be part of that initial packaging. But it is true that if whether it's state aid or any other aid, if you total it all up and it exceeds that cost of attendance for that student, they would not be eligible for the Pell. And there is, like I mentioned earlier, some ability to make an adjustment. Hope that was an okay answer. Let's see. How would the state's full tuition to students such as New Mexico, would those students not be eligible for Pell? I think it depends on if exceed cost of attendance. So if it's tuition and fees, they could still be eligible for a Pell Grant. But the other thing you could do is, you could work with the state. I mean, this might be difficult because this might be in statute, but the point I made earlier is there's opportunity for adjustment. So let's say you've got some sort of outside source, whether it's a state or private party. If you could go to them and have them adjust that amount down so that you are no longer exceeding cost of attendance, then you could qualify the student for the Pell, right? And so there is some opportunity to make that adjustment. And the department did not specify in the regulation how long you have to make that adjustment. I think it's just sort of under general Pell rules, you're expected to sort of do this in a timely way. But just keep in mind, it does the external aid, or it's not external, but the non-federal grants and scholarships have to exceed cost of attendance without the Pell Grant included. And so if they do, when you're packaging the student, you have opportunity to try to make adjustments to institutional aid, to the state program. But I think it is true, if you had a state university that offered an athlete or an academic, student an amount that exceeded, tuition fees with a stipend, et cetera, that exceeded cost of attendance, either you would have to adjust that award working with the state, or the student would not be eligible for Pell. I think that is the idea. And this is in statute. I mean, it's very, the department tried to create some opportunity to try to negotiate adjustments, but it is statutory. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try to get to one or two more. Will the data provided on the Department of Education's website be the best place to get information regarding earnings? Yeah, we don't even know right now where the department's going to go to get the earnings information. Like, that's not specified. Just with with financial value transparency and gainful employment, it just says the agency from which the department gets the earnings. And the department was upfront about the fact that it can be hard to negotiate these interagency agreements, and they've had some challenges doing so in the past. I think most people feel like IRS data is better because Social Security Administration data has a problem capturing self-employment income and some other classes of income, and that's a problem for programs that are producing a lot of graduates that are self-employed, et cetera. So the sense is that maybe the IRS data is a little bit better. Let's see. Let me try to do one more here. Okay, is it true from my good friend? Is it true that the online program offered in other states will still also have to meet the state authorization regulations in their states? 100%. This is not a substitute for state authorization, right? You as an institution will still have to be authorized to enroll people in that state. Now, if you're in Sarah, that would satisfy that obligation. But these are independent considerations. You have to be authorized, you have to be accredited, you have to satisfy the professional licensure obligations if it's a professional licensure or certification program. And then on top of all of that, if you want it to be eligible for eligible workforce Pell or workforce Pell, then what you're going to have, let me restate this. If you want to be able to disperse Pell grants because you want it to be classified as an eligible workforce Pell program, then you are going to have to get the approval from the governor in that state, or get approval under one of the bilateral agreements that the department allows for in the regulation. Again, these are draft text. This is assuming that this text becomes law. Please keep that in mind, but that is the idea. I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to cut us there. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, a lot of complicated stuff to go through. Hopefully this helped put some of it in context. This will be available as a recording, so if you want to come back and watch it at a later date, you can. As always, I'm very grateful for you for tuning in. To everyone out there in higher education, I will just say thank you for what you do. You are making extraordinary change in the world you're transforming. That is what education does. Have a happy holidays, whatever you may celebrate. And until next time,